Economist in 1982.
Former defense official.
For the way they did it.
But 25% of the world's prisoners. All Americans.
Legislation,
National security.
and they're following the vile maxim, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else.
The United States now extending from sea to shining seas. Expansionists coveted the scraps of the Spanish Empire.
Before the dark
Troops in
powers of destruction.
1961 into the tiny landlocked Asian.
In the second half of the 19th century, the Army of the United States fought a near-continuous series of battles with indigenous peoples across the American West. As the U.S. national territory expanded, it expanded not into empty land, but into the homes of Native American tribes who had lived on the land for thousands of years. The settler colonial project that started in the 13 colonies would soon spread across the continental United States, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and from the Arctic south deep into what had formerly been Mexico. Manifest Destiny, the white supremacist idea that white settlers were superior to indigenous Americans and Mexicans, and could therefore justifiably take their land, provided the ideological justification. It was, white settlers told themselves, God's will that they take over the continent. But their motivations were centered on the land and all that it contained. The enormous North American territories that would become the United States were rich in natural resources almost beyond imagining. Timber from the west, corn grown in the Great Plains, gold from California and the Black Hills, and oil throughout the land. It was these natural resources that prompted the violent and genocidal settlement of the American West. Throughout the second half of the 19th century, the majority of US troops were stationed in the West, fighting in what were referred to as the Indian Wars, a series of wars for control of the land. Throughout, Native Americans fought back as they were forced off their ancestral lands. The cost, in human life and in dollars, was enormous.
The settlers and the armed settlers had to fight for every inch of land they took, from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from the Gulf to the Canadian border. And that cost a lot. It cost, they had 5 regiments of 6 that existed out the Army of the West after the Civil War, fighting Plains people who were not that populous, not that many, but had horses, had taken horses from the Spanish and could defend themselves.
In California, according to research by Aaron Blakemore, in the 20 years following the discovery of gold in 1849, the reason the San Francisco Niners are called the 49ers and wear gold helmets, 80% of California's Native Americans were wiped out. And though some died because of the seizure of their land or diseases caught from new settlers, between 9,000 and 16,000 were murdered in cold blood, the victims of a policy of genocide sponsored by the state of California and gleefully assisted by its new citizens. An estimated 100,000 Native Americans died during the first 2 years of the gold rush alone. By 1873, only 30,000 indigenous people remained of around 150,000. During the Indian Wars, the US Army and white settlers carried out many massacres of indigenous peoples. The most famous came at Wounded Knee, where the US Army massacred several hundred Lakota people, mainly women and children. Modern scholars refer to US policies towards indigenous peoples as genocide, the deliberate destruction of a group of people. As historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz explains, according to the United Nations Convention adopted in 1948, the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, any one of 5 acts is considered genocide if committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Settler colonialism is inherently genocidal in terms of the Genocide Convention. In the case of the British North American colonies and the United States, not only extermination and removal were practiced, but also the disappearing of the prior existence of indigenous peoples. And this continues to be perpetuated in local histories. The Homestead Act of 1862 gave white settlers access to up to 160 acres of land, free or at very low cost. They were encouraged to farm it and develop homesteads, farms for one family. The act provided access to land for many Americans and recent immigrants to the country who would never have been able to find or buy land either in the East or in Europe. But it came at enormous cost. The land was not empty, but was the ancestral territory of Native Americans who had lived there for generations, and they didn't give it up without a fight. Additionally, while 160 acres was being offered to white settlers, newly freed African Americans, former slaves who became free at the end of the Civil War, were asking for 40 acres of land and a mule to farm it. They didn't get their 40 acres, a much smaller amount of land than the Homestead Act offered to white farmers, and were not allowed the free land offered to whites at this time. Around 1/4 of white Americans alive today can trace their family wealth back to the land given to their ancestors by the US government. Black Americans were excluded from this handout, and Native Americans lost everything. The Dawes Act sought to force the assimilation of Native Americans into white American culture and society. The Dawes Act ended Native American tribal life, destroying the cultural and political foundations of indigenous life. Most importantly, the Dawes Act privatized collectively owned indigenous tribal lands and separated them into individual family plots. Native Americans owned and worked the land collectively. They would now be forced to farm it in the same way that white American farmers did, as individuals and individual families. Many of the individual farms failed, and land speculators, businessmen who used land as an investment for profit, bought much of it for low prices, ending Native American ownership of huge swaths of land in the West. US policies towards Native Americans sought to eliminate them completely. Not only were there physical attacks on Native peoples, but their culture, language, and way of life were targeted for destruction. Indigenous peoples were forced to assimilate, to abandon their language, dress, and culture, and adopt white cultural norms, dress, and speak the English language. US authorities established boarding schools and kidnapped thousands of Native American children, separating them from their families and tribes and raising them as English-speaking, assimilated Americans.
You know, they're completely separated from their families and all. And they're told that they can be better off, you know, than being these savages that they were. And so it's just kind of a brainwashing to take the children away. He says it's hard with the adults. Some of them backslide, you know, and try to escape, and there's a rebel among them, but take them as children and put them far away from their families, cut their hair, and make them into, you know, and his motto was to kill the Indian and save the man. So that was, you know, to kill the Indian, that person, so they could just be an individual. Christianizing came along with it. So they set up these federal boarding schools, and then it became mandatory. All Native families had to bring their children in to be taken to, and so this whole network of boarding schools were set up. And if you didn't turn the children in, the army unit would come out and either take one of the people, usually the father of the family, away, imprison him until, they said where they're hiding the kids. And
motivations for westward expansion and the theft of indigenous land were complex. Racism certainly played a part, as indigenous peoples were dehumanized and made a target for white supremacist violence. But the primary motivator was economic. The natural resources of the American continent were, and still are, the means by which the United States became the largest economy and the richest country in the world. One of the most important developments in connecting the continental United States as a single national economy was the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, a railroad that connected the eastern United States with the Pacific West Coast, crossing the entire country. This railroad connected previously inaccessible territories, allowing them to be settled by white settler farmers. The railroad was a crucial development for the industrial American economy, and a disaster for indigenous peoples and the buffalo, which provided their food and clothing.